17. Sarah Rivera and Deborah Green. While working at a Hooters restaurant in the Chicago suburb of Oak Lawn, Illinois in 2017, 25-year-old Sarah Rivera and 24-year-old Deborah Green got into a fistfight inside their workplace. It's unclear what sparked the brawl between the waitresses, who were broken up by responding police officers, or if either of the women lost their job. Rivera and Green were both charged with disorderly conduct. However, they were released after each posting a $120 bond. 16. Amelia Holden. 21-year-old Amelia Holden was working as a waitress in Savannah, Georgia in 2018, when a man later identified as 31-year-old Ryan Chawinski walked by and grabbed her backside. Footage of the encounter showed Holden putting Chawinski into a headlock, slamming him against a wall and throwing him to the ground. One of Holden's co-workers called the police, and Chawinski was arrested the next day on suspicion of battery. News sources later revealed that the father of two from Palm Bay, Florida, was at the restaurant with his girlfriend of 11 years, Erica Martin. Holden told Inside Edition that she couldn't repeat most of the things she said to Chawinski as she was seen scolding him on camera, but that she had no regrets about taking action against the accused groper. Speaking with People magazine, she said that she reacted instinctively after initially thinking her friend had grabbed her as a joke. When the groper's hand traveled too far, she realized it wasn't a joke and that she had been accosted by a stranger. Holden claimed that Chawinski tried telling police that he was innocently trying to move the waitress out of the way as he walked past, but the surveillance video spoke for itself. The footage went viral, and Holden used her newfound internet fame to spread the message that women have a right to defend themselves when someone invades their space. She also used the media attention she received as an opportunity to give back to the community by raising more than $18,000 for local cat shelters. 15. Rosemary Hayne. When 39-year-old Rosemary Hayne disapproved of how her food was prepared at a Chipotle restaurant in Palmer, Ohio in September 2023, she went 0 to 100 on the employee who served her. Bystander footage showed Hayne approaching the counter, slamming her bowl down, and then throwing it in Emily Russell's face. Hayne was arrested for her behavior and was found guilty of assault by the judge who oversaw the case. He gave her two options for her punishment: 90 days in jail or 30 days in jail plus 2 months suspended if she worked at least 20 hours per week at a fast food restaurant. She chose the latter, which the judge saw as a good opportunity for her to learn a lesson about empathy and a preferable alternative to having her sit and eat taxpayer-funded jail food for 3 months. While handing down the sentence, the judge admonished Hayne for her behavior, saying that she acted like she was on the reality show Real Housewives. He also said that he hoped the punishment would teach her a lesson. Russell, who was at the hearing, told Fox 8 that she thought the punishment was fair and that it wasn't just a slap on the wrist. Hayne apologized to Russell, but pointed out that the food looked disgusting, at which point the judge reminded her that she likely wasn't going to enjoy jail food any better. 14. Darren Hickey. In October 2019, Darren Hickey died in a freak accident while working as a wedding venue manager in the English town of Chorley. He was leaving the venue in Lancashire, known as the Ridgemont House, when a chef asked him to sample a fish cake. It was extremely hot, causing the back of Hickey's mouth to swell and making it difficult for him to breathe. Hickey went to the hospital, where he was given a prescription for medication and was discharged with instructions to return if his condition worsened. Unfortunately, that's exactly what happened, and he died the next day. The pathologist who performed Hickey's autopsy told the press that the circumstances of his death were very rare. Dr. Patrick Warr explained that the condition the deceased business manager experienced is most often seen when people inhale smoke during a house fire or steam during industrial accidents. At first, the patient doesn't appear to be injured, but as their throat swells, it gets increasingly difficult to get enough air. Hickey's partner overheard him choking and called for paramedics, who did everything in their power to try to save Hickey, but sadly, he was pronounced dead at the scene. 13. Sher A. On the 4th of July holiday in 1982, a Domino's restaurant in Salem, Oregon received an order for 3 large pizzas, along with an odd request for a worker who drove an orange Volkswagen to make the delivery. But the employee wasn't working at the time, so 18-year-old Sher A was dispatched to the address. She never returned from making the delivery, and it was later discovered that the address she had been given didn't exist. The call to Domino's had been placed from a local motel under a fake name. Later that night, Sherry's car was found idling with the headlights on in an isolated area near the Willamette River. The food she was trying to deliver was found scattered and stepped on nearby, along with the hat she wore as part of her uniform. Sherry's body was never found, and the case went unsolved for 25 years. Finally, though, in 2006, an inmate serving 2 life terms for other murders confessed to killing Sherry. William Scott Smith had been questioned shortly after the teen's disappearance and had given an alibi, which later proved to be false. During his confession, he admitted to targeting a different Domino's employee, the one who owned the orange Volkswagen, who he planned to kidnap and hold for ransom. When Sherry showed up instead, Smith strangled her and tossed her body into the Willamette River. The crime was committed with the help from an accomplice named Roger Nosef, who died from cancer 4 years before Smith confessed. Smith was handed an additional life term for Sherry's murder, and in 2012 he was sentenced to a 4th life term for the death of another woman. He also remains a suspect in several other cases. 12. Dairy Queen Meth Ring. In June of 2023, authorities in Clifton, Texas received a tip that a group of employees at a local Dairy Queen restaurant were operating a methamphetamine ring. During the appropriately named Operation Blizzard investigation, undercover officers bought drugs from the workers. They soon discovered that the meth was also being sold elsewhere and that the organization was bigger than they originally suspected. In early 2024, police raided 3 homes and arrested 10 people, including 4 individuals who allegedly had meth in their possession. The Dairy Queen employees who were accused of being involved in the drug ring were fired from their jobs following their arrests. Included among the suspects is Bradley Calderon, who faces 3 counts of manufacture or delivery of a controlled substance. Adrian Bernard Edwards was also involved and was charged with 4 counts of manufacture or delivery of a controlled substance in a drug-free zone. Another suspect was Shelby Sedberry, who was also hit with multiple counts of manufacture or delivery of a controlled substance in a drug-free zone. 7 others faced similar charges, and local police chief Chris Blanton used the news of the arrests as an opportunity to warn the public that law enforcement is making moves to combat drug activity in the area. 11. Cyrus Cahi. 38-year-old Cyrus Cahi was well on the way to achieving the American dream. After immigrating to Louisiana from Iran to attend college during the 1970s, he visited California and loved it so much that he decided to stay. In the early 90s, Cahi married a Korean tourist named Jasmine while working as the manager of a Denny's restaurant in Reseda. They became a couple and carried on a long-distance relationship for 2 years while waiting for their K-1 fiancé visa application to go through. It was eventually approved, and the couple married in 1995. By then, Cahi had become part owner of the restaurant and was able to provide his wife with a comfortable home in Sherman Oaks. But tragedy struck just 11 months later when a robber stormed into the restaurant during an overnight shift and demanded money from the register. Sadly, Cahi was fatally shot in the chest despite obeying the thief's commands. The gunman, 20-year-old Ruben Lopez, was convicted of Cahi's murder and was sentenced to life without parole. His getaway driver, 19-year-old Samuel Martinez, was also found guilty and received the same sentence. Because Jasmine hadn't been in the US long enough to get her green card when Cahi was killed, immigration authorities sought to deport her. She fought for her right to stay in the country, which was temporarily extended so she could attend the accused killer's trials. In the meantime, lawmakers sponsored special legislation to make an exception that would allow Jasmine to stay in the United States permanently. She told the Los Angeles Daily News that she didn't want to return to Korea, where she faced social stigmas for being both a widow and an orphan. The bill was finally approved in 1998, and she was granted permanent residency. 10. Jill Renck. As Hurricane Harvey descended on Houston in August 2017, 48-year-old Jill Renck attempted to ride out the storm at the Omni Houston Hotel, where she worked as the director of spa services. But little did she know that the hotel sits along a floodplain. Renck was staying in a fourth-floor room with her dog, but went down to the lobby to help evacuate guests. By then, water was already rushing into the building. She went back upstairs, but was called down to the lobby at around 5:15 a.m. And for reasons that remain unclear to this day, she took a service elevator to the basement. According to reports, Renck would have been unable to access the service elevator from the floor she was staying on. The dedicated employee vanished during the devastating storm after calling a friend in a panic while water gushed into the elevator. She also tried to call the hotel's front desk, but no one answered. People could reportedly hear her screaming for help, but nobody came to her aid. By the time Renck was summoned downstairs, the elevator should have been shut off due to the flooding. But the hotel's director of engineering, who was normally responsible for shutting off the elevators during a flood, had chosen to wait out the storm elsewhere. Several other members of the hotel's emergency response team had also made arrangements in other places. Divers and firefighters tried to find Renck, but she was nowhere to be seen. Her dog was found in her hotel room, and her car was discovered abandoned in the parking lot. After 11 days of searching, Rennick's loved ones learned that her body had been found in the hotel's basement ceiling. Surveillance footage captured some of her agonizing final moments as she pried open the elevator doors and fought against the rushing water. Renck most likely went into the basement ceiling in an attempt to get air, but the water eventually rose high enough to cut off her oxygen supply and she drowned. The woman's death was one of the most perplexing mysteries surrounding Hurricane Harvey. The tragedy remained shrouded in unanswered questions, including why nobody warned her about the flooding when staff members allegedly knew about it. 9. The Taco Bell Strangler. Over a 4-year period starting in early 1990, U.S. Navy veteran Henry Louis Wallace murdered 11 women in North and South Carolina. Just 5 years earlier, he was living a respectable lifestyle. He married his high school sweetheart while serving in the Navy and took on the role of stepfather to his wife's daughter. But by the time Wallace was discharged from the military in 1988, he was addicted to crack cocaine and other drugs and had started committing robberies to finance his habit. Several arrests followed, and his wife left him soon after. He escalated his crimes to murder 2 years later and was even questioned as a suspect after killing his first victim. However, he managed to avoid formally being charged in the case. Wallace met his third victim, 20-year-old Shauna Hawk, while working as her manager at a Taco Bell restaurant in Charlotte, North Carolina. In February 1993, Hawk was found strangled to death in her bedroom at her family's home. Wallace attended her funeral a few days later, flying completely under the radar of both the police and the victim's loved ones. 4 months later, his 24-year-old co-worker Audrey Spain became Wallace's 4th victim. His 6th victim, 20-year-old Michelle Stinson, was also a co-worker. But Wallace was finally caught in 1994 after murdering 3 victims over 4 days. During questioning, he confessed in detail to killing 10 women in the Charlotte area and 1 in South Carolina. Until then, police were unaware that there was a serial killer on the loose. They'd even arrested Wallace several times over the years for theft and other crimes, but had never connected him to any killings. Many community members felt that law enforcement had failed to identify the links between the killings because they simply weren't paying much attention to the deaths of young black women. Charlotte Mecklenburg Police Deputy Chief Larry Snyder apologized for not realizing sooner that the murders were the work of a serial killer. He claimed that the crimes were varied and sporadic enough to make them seem unconnected. Speaking with A&E's True Crime series, former homicide detective Gary McFadden explained that 1993 was one of Charlotte's deadliest years on record. The surge was reportedly fueled by the crack cocaine epidemic, which drove up violent crime in the area. McFadden also said that Wallace wasn't caught sooner because he put anything he believed he'd touched at a crime scene in the oven to evaporate his fingerprints. Opinions over whether race played a role in the failure to catch Wallace sooner remain divided. In 1997, Wallace was found guilty of 9 murders and received 9 death sentences. He married a woman in a jailhouse ceremony the following year. Wallace attempted to appeal his case several times, claiming that his confessions were coerced and that his constitutional rights were violated. But his conviction and sentence were upheld, and he remains on death row. There have been no executions in North Carolina since 2006 due to a series of lawsuits challenging the death penalty. That means that Wallace and other death row prisoners may end up serving life behind bars instead. 8. Larry Eli Murillo Moncada. 25-year-old Larry Eli Murillo Moncada was last seen running barefoot out of his parents' home in Council Bluffs, Iowa during a blizzard in 2009. He left his car behind despite the frigid winter storm conditions. Larry's family reported him missing, but he was never seen or heard from again. The case was cold from the beginning, and it stayed that way, leading Larry's mother and father to wonder if they would ever find out what happened to their son. Shortly after the young man's disappearance, his mother Anna told the Daily Nonpareil that Larry had recently come home from his shift at a local grocery store acting disoriented. She took him to a doctor who prescribed an antidepressant to Larry, but it didn't seem to help, and Larry's symptoms soon worsened as he began to hallucinate and hear voices. He thought someone was following him and became increasingly irrational. During the investigation, Anna theorized that Larry went to his workplace and never left. It's unclear what led her to believe this, especially because Larry wasn't scheduled to work that day and there were no outward signs of her son being there. Answers finally came 10 years later in 2019, when a contractor was hired to remove old shelving units and coolers from the now shuttered grocery store where Larry had worked before he vanished. And, as it turned out, his mother's instinct proved correct. While pulling out a set of coolers that sat roughly 18 inches from the wall behind them, the team discovered a decaying body. It was wearing the same clothes Larry was last seen in and was later confirmed to be the long-missing man. According to CNN, employees used to climb on top of the coolers to a storage space when they wanted to take an unofficial break. It appeared as though Larry went up there, perhaps to be alone as he experienced a mental crisis, and fell 12 feet down into the narrow gap between the units and the wall. His calls for help may have gone unnoticed due to the noise of the machine's compressors. So, in the end, Larry's death was ruled accidental, and the case was finally closed. 7. Nathan Leon. While working at his second job as a Domino's delivery driver in March of 2013, 27-year-old father of 3 Nathan Leon was lured to a recycling center near Denver. He never returned from the delivery and was found murdered outside the business. Authorities eventually traced the crime to 28-year-old Evan Spencer Ebel, a neo-Nazi and convicted felon who had recently skipped out on his parole. According to news reports, he had prior arrests for burglary, assault, weapons, menacing, robbery, and trespassing. Ebel was part of a white supremacist gang called the 211 Crew, and he spent most of his prison time in solitary confinement due to disciplinary violations. According to investigators, Ebel forced Leon into the trunk of his car at gunpoint and then forced him to make an audio recording denouncing the prison system. 2 days after Leon was killed, Ebel showed up at the home of Colorado Department of Corrections Chief Tom Clements, wearing the victim's Domino's uniform. When 58-year-old Clements answered the door, Ebel fatally shot him and fled Colorado, triggering a nationwide manhunt. He was killed 2 days later in a gunfight with Texas law enforcement. Detectives concluded that Leon was murdered for his uniform. There's been speculation about the murders of Leon and Clements being part of a bigger conspiracy masterminded by the 211 Crew, but these allegations have never been proven. 6. Tatum Goodwin. In November 2023, a construction worker found the murdered body of a young woman in an alleyway in Laguna Beach, California. The killer had put a sandbag on top of her head and stuffed her behind a chain-link fence. Identified as 27-year-old Tatum Goodwin of Saint Clement, the slain woman was an employee at a nearby restaurant called Carmelitas. Following an investigation, authorities charged 26-year-old Dino Rojas Moreno with murder. According to prosecutors, Rojas Moreno worked as a bartender at the nearby Royal Hawaiian Fire Grill. He allegedly approached Goodwin in a parking lot outside their workplaces at around 1 a.m. and assaulted her near her vehicle. Investigators said that the suspect then dragged Goodwin out of the parking lot and behind a movie theater, where he bludgeoned her to death with a fire extinguisher. Later that day, Rojas Moreno failed to show up for his shift. He reportedly claimed that 2 men had beaten him up, but the story didn't add up, and he soon found himself at the top of the suspect list. Authorities were unsure whether the victim and perpetrator knew each other, but Goodwin's friends claimed that she didn't know Rojas Moreno. The suspect was charged with special circumstances murder during a kidnapping, with an enhancement for using a deadly weapon. Rojas Moreno pleaded not guilty, and he continues to maintain his innocence from behind bars while being held without bond. 5. Anthony Rodriguez. 26-year-old waiter Anthony Rodriguez was working the overnight shift at a George Webb restaurant in Wauwatosa, Wisconsin in 2022, when a group of 4 women got impatient while waiting for their food. 2 of the diners, later identified as 20-year-old sisters Brianna and Brianta Johnson, allegedly nagged Rodriguez and other employees to hurry up with their meals. But the women only became even more enraged when they received their food and it wasn't to their liking. They threatened not to pay for their orders, so Rodriguez took their plates away and threw their meals in the garbage. According to a criminal complaint, Brianta exited the restaurant and returned moments later with a gun, while Brianna argued with staff members at the front counter. Brianta handed the gun to Brianna, then punched Rodriguez in the face and wrestled him to the ground. Once she had the man in a helpless position, Brianna allegedly shot him in the neck. And before leaving the restaurant, one of the sisters stomped on the victim's head. Miraculously though, Rodriguez survived his injuries, and the sisters were arrested on suspicion of first-degree attempted homicide. Speaking with Fox 6 Now a few weeks after the assault, Rodriguez said that he wasn't even scheduled to work on the night of the incident. He'd been called to fill in for another employee, and the restaurant was busy. There was a mistake with one of the suspect's orders, and before Rodriguez could do much about it, the Johnson sisters allegedly lost their cool and became aggressive. Knowing the altercation could have had a much deadlier outcome, Rodriguez was extremely grateful that he survived. He was also happy about how fast his recovery was moving along, although he was unsure whether he'd make it back to 100% health. The close call alerted him to the need for people to resolve disputes more peacefully and inspired him to discourage others from resorting to violence during disagreements. After being warned by doctors that he may never walk again, Rodriguez regained his mobility. In addition to the physical healing, he underwent months of therapy to deal with emotional trauma stemming from the assault. He eventually found a new job and returned to work full-time. In December 2022, Brianna Johnson pleaded guilty to a reduced charge of first-degree reckless injury. She was sentenced to 10 years in prison, followed by 5 years of probation. Brianta Johnson pleaded guilty to the same charge and received a 6-year sentence plus 4 years of probation. They were also both required to attend anger management and receive mental health treatment. 4. Hassan Raman. In November 2017, a passerby discovered the dead body of a 26-year-old pizza delivery driver named Hassan Raman in the trunk of his car. The victim had failed to return home from his shift while working for a Pizza Hut restaurant in Wichita, Kansas the night before. He was found 3 miles from the addresses of his last 2 deliveries and had been shot in the head. Raman's life was just starting out when it was abruptly cut short. The married father had moved to Wichita from Bangladesh to pursue a college education 7 years earlier, and he ended up making the city his permanent home. He was well liked by all who knew him, and even the police couldn't figure out why someone would have wanted him dead. While searching the address of Raman's last delivery, investigators found items belonging to Pizza Hut that they say the driver wouldn't have left behind by accident. The Pizza Hut sign for the top of his car was found elsewhere in the neighborhood several days later. Nobody's ever been charged with Raman's murder, despite a $10,000 reward being offered by Pizza Hut for information leading to an arrest. Police have also failed to establish a likely motive for the crime. On that same evening, nearby resident 62-year-old Huang Pham and her son 23-year-old Cody Ha were shot to death inside their home. At the time of the double homicide, Cody was gaming online with several friends from around the country who overheard the gunshots inside the residence. Little else is known about the crime, including the killer's suspected motive. At one point, investigators suspected that the murders of Raman, Huang Pham, and Cody Ha could be related, but it's unclear whether this is still the case because all three killings remain unsolved. 3. Kashai Lynette Christmas. After being fired from a smoothie shop in Houston in December 2022, 34-year-old Kashai Lynette Christmas allegedly kidnapped her former boss. Apparently, she had been let go after repeatedly showing up late for work, and she didn't respond well to the bad news. The final straw came when Christmas pulled a no-call, no-show, solidifying the manager's decision to fire her. When Christmas came into the shop the next day for her paycheck, the managers had briefly stepped out to handle her duties at another location. An employee told Christmas that she was fired, and she allegedly threw a tantrum. When the manager returned, Christmas demanded her paycheck. According to a police report, the disgruntled former employee slammed the manager against a wall repeatedly, slapped her in the face several times, and choked her to the point where she couldn't breathe. The complaint also stated that Christmas's daughter was yelling at her mum to let go of the manager. But instead of listening to common sense, Christmas demanded money from the manager and walked her across the street to a bank under the threat of shoving her into traffic if she refused to cooperate. Christmas was also accused of taking the victim's phone and ordering her to withdraw $200 from her bank account. Fearing for her life, the manager complied. As soon as the suspect left the scene, the victim ran back to the smoothie shop, locked herself in the bathroom, and dialed 911. During the investigation, police discovered surveillance footage of Christmas taking photos of the manager's credit cards and going through the safe in the smoothie shop's office. She also turned the security monitor off before assaulting the manager, unaware that the camera was still recording. And later that day, the manager received threatening text messages. By the time the investigation was underway, Christmas was long gone from the crime scene. Authorities issued a warrant charging her with aggravated kidnapping, robbery with bodily harm, and retaliation. Shortly before this incident, Christmas bonded out of jail after assaulting one of her family members on June 8, 2022. Unfortunately, it's unclear if she's currently behind bars. 2. Shelly Ly. 19-year-old single mum Shelly Ly was just a month into her job as a waitress at the Lanark Diner in Upper Darby, Pennsylvania, when she vanished in August of 1982. She was thriving at her new workplace and was finally ready to move out of her parents' house, where she was living with her young daughter at the time. Shelly had an appointment to sign the lease for an apartment the next day, but she left the restaurant after finishing her shift at 11 p.m. and was never seen again. Before leaving work, Shelly spent a few minutes talking to her mother, who worked the overnight shift at the restaurant. She got her mum's permission to borrow her stepdad's car to go visit a friend and was on her way. But when Shelly failed to return home, her parents knew something was wrong. She would never abandon her daughter, and the police agreed that the situation pointed toward foul play. Witnesses described seeing a young woman matching Shelly's description talking to a man outside, but a composite sketch of the man failed to yield any useful leads. Numerous sightings of Shelly were reported after her disappearance, but none of them were ever confirmed. Not a single solid trace of the young woman has turned up since, and her stepfather's car was also never found. Her friends and family underwent polygraph exams and were ruled out as persons of interest, leaving detectives stumped about what direction to take the investigation in. With no leads to go on, the FBI closed Shelly's case in 1984. Her families never stopped looking for her, but they're no closer to finding her than they were on the night she vanished. And now for number 1. But if you want to hear more bizarre and crazy stories, stay tuned after the video for some more content. 1. The Burger Chef Murders. Late one night in November 1978, an employee stopped to visit his co-workers at a Burger Chef restaurant in Speedway, Indiana. It was around midnight, and the crew should have been working on their closing duties. But the restaurant was completely empty, the safe was open, and the back door was ajar. Restaurant employees Jane Freet, Daniel Davis, Mark Flemons, and Ruth Ellen Shelton were nowhere to be found. Police initially weren't too worried about the situation. There were no signs of a struggle, and only around $600 was taken from the safe. Investigators assumed that the employees were responsible for the theft, and that they'd used the money to go out partying, even though the female workers' purses and jackets were found at the restaurant. The next day, Jane Freet's car was found elsewhere in town, and at this point, it became evident that the police were likely wrong with their initial assessment about the workers ditching their workplace voluntarily. 2 days after the employees went missing, hikers found their bodies 20 miles away in a wooded area. Daniel Davis and Ruth Ellen Shelton had been shot multiple times. Jane Freet had been stabbed in the chest, and Mark Flemons choked to death on his own blood after being bludgeoned. All 4 victims were wearing their work uniforms, and the killers didn't steal their jewelry or money, indicating that robbery may not have been the sole motive for the quadruple murder. By the time the bodies were discovered, the crime scene had been cleaned up. No evidence had been taken since the police didn't think anything too serious had happened, so to this day the murders remain unsolved. Investigators suspect that one of the workers recognized one of the killers in a robbery gone wrong. Flemons was filling in for another employee, leading police to believe that the culprits may not have expected him to be there, and that he may have been the one who recognized the killers. In 1984, an inmate named Donald Forrester confessed to shooting Davis and Shelton. He was able to provide detectives with information about the crime that hadn't been released to the public. According to the story he gave to law enforcement, he and 3 accomplices went to the restaurant to threaten Jane Freet, whose brother owed him for a drug debt. But Mark Flemons intervened during the confrontation and hit his head on a car bumper during a struggle that ensued. Believing that Flemons was dead or dying, the suspects reportedly decided to abduct and kill the entire crew to eliminate all the witnesses. Forrester agreed to cooperate with the case, but recanted his confession and claimed that it was coerced after someone leaked the details of his involvement with the authorities. He died in prison in 2006, and nobody's been prosecuted for the murders since. Investigators believe that they've identified some of the perpetrators, but unfortunately, they lack enough physical evidence to pursue a case against them.
Number 10. Arrested for tipping. In 2019, a woman from New York was arrested for leaving a tip at a restaurant in Florida. The tip was for the shocking amount of $5,000. And while this might sound like a good deed, something that should have made the server's whole month, it was actually an evil act of revenge. At least, that's according to the police. The perpetrator's name is Serena Wolf, and she was charged with grand theft. She apparently used a boyfriend's credit card to not only pay for her meal, but to leave the whopping $5,000 tip on her $55 check. Prior to Serena eating at the Clear Sky Cafe in Clearwater Beach, she had gotten into an argument with her boyfriend. According to what he told officers, she was angry that he refused to pay for her plane ticket back to New York. Following the argument, Serena got drunk, she got mad, and she left a fat tip just to get back at him with his own card. She figured if he wouldn't pay for her flight, he could stand to lose the $5,000. She was charged, but as for the money, it appeared to be long gone, split between the server and the rest of the workers at the establishment. After all, it wasn't the cafe's fault they were the recipients of Serena's revenge. Number 9. Cold chicken. In the middle of June back in 2017, chaos erupted at a Quick Chick food stand in Georgia. Latasha Denise Smith and her father, Nathaniel Smith, became enraged when the chicken they just purchased was too cold for their liking. They confronted the owner of the stand, Jeanette Norris, about their chili chicken. But instead of just talking to Jeanette like normal people, they became irate, violent, and confrontational. Latasha then was caught on surveillance video punching Jeanette in the face and knocking her down, just before her father started throwing his fist at her daughter. Jeanette's daughter was only 15 years old at the time, 30 years younger than Nathaniel. The grown man punched the child, knocked her against a brick wall, and then took off running, all over some cold chicken. But don't worry, because this is one of those stories where the attackers really got what was coming. Nathaniel Smith was sentenced to 8 years in prison for aggravated battery and cruelty to children, plus 7 years of probation. His daughter was sentenced to 2 years in prison for aggravated battery. On the day of the sentencing, Jeanette and her daughter were present and made statements in court. And although their attackers were punished accordingly, it still won't take away the trauma of being beaten up over cold chicken. Number 8. Drivethru Insanity. A woman was arrested in Oklahoma City back in 2010 for losing her temper at a McDonald's drive-thru. Her name is Sher A, and she was 20 years old when the cops put her in handcuffs for public intoxication, an outstanding traffic warrant, and just being generally terrible in public. It all started just after midnight on a Tuesday. The police were called to the McDonald's restaurant. The manager of the joint told the cops that Sierra placed an order in the drive-thru, drove right past the first window where she was supposed to pay, and then pulled up to the second window and started getting belligerent. The employee there told her she needed to pay for her food, and that caused her to get more hostile and more disagreeable. She screamed at the employee, claimed that she had indeed paid for a meal when she definitely had not, then got out of her car. Like some kind of troll, she climbed into the drive-thru window and started flailing around, knocking milkshakes off the counter. She refused to leave, but was eventually forced out of the window. But here's the truly insane part. As if she was in the right, Sierra parked her car in the parking lot and just sat there staring at the restaurant. When the police showed up, she was still sitting there. The police realized she was drunk, and so they put her under arrest and carted her away to jail. Number 7. Dead at Little Caesars. In March of 2022, Little Caesars employees in San Antonio made an extremely disturbing discovery. Employees of the restaurant, located near downtown, came across a woman leaning on the wall behind the restaurant, bleeding to death. Shocked, not understanding what was happening, the employees immediately called the police. The cops arrived at about 11 o'clock at night to find a woman named Jessica Medina in a puddle of blood near a dumpster. She was alive when the Little Caesars employees had found her, but had bled out by the time the police arrived. Paramedics pronounced her dead at the scene. There was no accident either. The police are investigating Medina's death as a homicide. They discovered traumatic wounds to her head, suggesting she had been beaten viciously and then left behind the Little Caesars restaurant to die. After 42 years on this planet, the poor woman lost her life beside a dumpster outside a cheap pizza joint. It really doesn't get much more tragic than that. Number 6. Drunk at Taco Bell. In the summer of 2019, yet another drunk woman embarrassed herself at a fast food joint. This time, it was at Taco Bell. It was such a strange encounter for the local Oregon police that the department posted a woman's mugshot on their Facebook page, captioned, "Weirdest DUI arrest of the weekend." The woman is Eliana Aguilar. She pulled into the drive-thru of the Taco Bell in Beaverton, right in front of a police officer. When she came up to the window, there was a cop in the squad car literally right behind her. The cop could see everything she was doing, but that didn't stop her from acting completely ridiculous. She pulled a bottle of alcohol out of her car, leaned into the drive-thru window, and then poured the booze into the employee's mouth. It doesn't look like the employee was being forced to drink. Eliana was drunk and rambunctious and offered the employee a drink. That in itself isn't such an awful thing, but when the cop behind her saw what was happening and made the arrest, they found Eliana's blood alcohol content to be way over the legal limit. She was driving around wasted, giving away free shots to Taco Bell employees, so she was charged with a DUI and taken to jail. Number 5. Monkeying around. In August of 2014, outside of a restaurant in Beaumont, California, a woman was attacked by a monkey. According to a spokesperson for the Riverside County Animal Services, John Welsh, a 35-year-old woman from Cherry Valley was the victim of the simian attack. She was sitting outside Antonio's Pizza at about 3:30 in the afternoon on a Sunday when she was brutally attacked by a capuchin monkey. She had to be treated at the hospital for a laceration to her forearm, and she was traumatized by the totally unexpected incident. The last thing anyone anticipates while they're sitting outside a pizza restaurant in the middle of the afternoon is to be the victim of a monkey assault. But of course, this wasn't just some stray monkey running through the streets. It was a pet, owned by a woman named Gwendolyn Ringle. She was forced to surrender her pet to animal services, who then impounded the primate while they figured out what to do with it. In other words, it went to monkey jail. The actual attack is even crazier than you're going to believe. It involved 3 monkeys. Gwendolyn had a bit of a monkey problem. She was passing by the restaurant on her way to the parking lot with her trio of primates in tow, when one of her monkeys got away from her, grabbed hold of the victim, and took a bite out of her arm like it was sinking its teeth into a juicy burrito. Because the monkey lady didn't have permits to own such animals, all 3 of them were taken away. The one responsible for the attack had to be put in quarantine for 6 months in case it had some kind of virus. Plus, Gwendolyn was forced to pay for its stay there. And then in the end, she wasn't even allowed to get her monkeys back. Number 4. Stung by a wasp. A 68-year-old British woman, an expat living in Spain, was in the beautiful city of Costa Blanca in May of 2022. She was dining at a restaurant and enjoying the warm Spanish weather when she got stung by a wasp. Normally, this wouldn't be a very big deal. Wasps are everywhere, and people get stung by them all the time. It's certainly better to be stung by a wasp than bitten by a monkey. Unless, of course, you're this woman, who suffered anaphylactic shock and died. Her heart stopped beating right there in front of the Hilltop Gastro Pub. Paramedics tried to bring her back to life by performing CPR, but it all happened so fast, there was nothing they could do. It was about 2 p.m. when the woman was stung by the wasp, sitting outside on the veranda with friends and family. And by 3 p.m., she was being taken away in the back of an ambulance. What happened was that this woman had likely gone her whole life without ever being stung by a wasp, so she never knew that she was deathly allergic to them. Then, on this fateful day, she figured it out the hard way. Her body went into shock. The wasp venom pumped into her veins, and that was all she wrote. Unfortunate, but totally out of the victim's control. There was just no way she could have prepared herself for such a random disaster. Number 3. Spiked in Bavaria. In late winter of 2022, a group of people drank some champagne at a bar in Bavaria, Germany. A 52-year-old man dropped dead. Others became violently ill, all after drinking from the same bottle of wine. Nobody had any idea what in the world was going on, as all these people started dropping like flies. It wasn't until later, when the police were able to test the champagne, that they found it spiked with the illegal drug ecstasy. It took a little while for the victims themselves to figure out that they had been poisoned, and by the time they did, it was too late for them to do anything about it. The employees at the restaurant called emergency responders. Then, when the paramedics arrived, there were 8 people collapsed on the floor and writhing in confusion and misery. These people had no idea what drug they'd just taken and were high out of their minds, freaking out. All 8 of them, between the ages of 33 and 52, were rushed to the hospital. All these months later, we still don't know what happened. The police say it was probably negligent homicide, but they don't know who slipped the liquid ecstasy into the champagne bottle, or for what purpose. It wasn't a targeted attack. Nobody had anything against this group of people. It may have been one of them trying to spice up the party, or they may have been given the wrong champagne bottle. Number 2. Mexico City tacos gone wrong. A man in Mexico City is facing charges of attempted murder after a brutal daylight attack at a restaurant in spring of 2022. The man, identified by Mexican authorities as Siddhartha N., picked up a boulder, hefted it over his head with both hands, and brought it down on the back of the skull of a 19-year-old named Andrew Nava. He did it in broad daylight, inside a taco restaurant in the trendy Roman neighborhood. The whole thing was captured on security cameras inside the restaurant. But what makes it so completely horrifying is that the attack was unprovoked. Andrew had been sitting inside the restaurant with his father when the man picked up the stone slab and tried to cave his head in for no reason. The two had never met. They had never spoken to one another. The attacker was simply a man who lived on the street in the Roma area, and at that moment when he walked past the restaurant, he decided to kill someone. It's scary because it could happen to anyone. You're trying to enjoy a nice meal in your favorite restaurant, the next thing you know, some random person is bashing you in the head with a rock. Luckily, Andrew was quickly brought to the hospital and was last reported in stable condition. he'll pull through, but it was a close call. He may lose his sense of smell permanently, but at least he'll be alive. Number 1. The Sword Breakin. A man in Florida has been arrested and charged with burglary after he used a sword to break in through the drive-thru of a Wendy's and stuff his face with a bunch of random food. His name is Philip Tran, and he committed one of the most bizarre burglaries in restaurant history. Northport officers were called at about 6:30 in the morning on a Tuesday in April of 2022. Philip had forced his way through the window with his samurai sword, then wreaked havoc inside the restaurant. He ate whatever food he could find, discharged a fire extinguisher, and then fled like a crazy person. The damages totaled about $300, and Philip was tracked down about an hour later. The next day, he told the police that he couldn't even remember what had happened. Apparently, Philip had been given medication by his doctor for ADHD and depression, but instead of curing his ailments, it caused him to black out and go on a crazy crime spree. He was released from prison soon after and ordered to seek a psychiatrist.
Would you rather work on a cruise vessel during a major virus outbreak, or at a fast food restaurant in an area that's experiencing a violent crime surge? Let us know in the comments down below. And if you enjoyed this video, be sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one. Bye.